Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Full Committee on Armed Services meeting today to discuss extremism in the armed services. I will introduce our witnesses in just a moment, but first, this hearing is going to be mostly virtual. Mr. Rogers and I and a few others are here in the room, but most of our members are participating remotely. Two of our three witnesses are here. One of them is participating remotely. So I will read our little remote hearing statement here. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us and for having this hearing. I think this is a very important discussion, and to begin with, one of my biggest goals for this hearing is to better define our terms. We have heard a lot recently about extremism within the military. I think it's really crucially important that we drill down and understand what that means and what we're really trying to get at, and how we want to make sure that we remove that from the military. It is not the case that extremism is simply anyone who disagrees with your political views. And I think increasingly I've seen some who sort of take it to that level. People who serve in the military are entitled to have political views. Those views will undoubtedly be different from each other, and we have to figure out how to make that work. But extremism itself is something that goes way beyond that, and something that we are concerned about. And I want to sort of put it into two categories for the purpose of this hearing. One is, the concerns that we have with a rise in white supremacy and white nationalism and racism. And this sort of dovetails with another challenge that we're taking on in the military, and that is the need to increase diversity in the military. Secretary Austin gave very, very powerful testimony during his confirmation hearing about his experience, coming up as a black person within the military and rising through the ranks and some of the challenges that he faced. And there is no doubt when you look at the military right now, particularly in terms of our leadership, it does not reflect the diversity of our country. And there is much more work that needs to be done. It is also unequivocally clear that racism continues to occur within the ranks, and we must work to root out this bigotry and deal with that problem in a comprehensive manner. I applaud Secretary Austin for the steps he has taken since becoming secretary. As most of you know, he has ordered a series of stand-downs where you take a day to talk about this within the ranks. I think that is an excellent place to start, but there is much more work that needs to be done. Lastly, there is a growing extremism that I am really troubled by, and that is sort of anti-government extremism. And we hear this rhetoric constantly in many, many different forums, that somehow because our political side is not sufficiently winning, that means that the entire system must be torn down and rebuilt. That we need a revolution, that the government is not legitimate, that it is fake, it is a fraud, it is all manner of different terrible and awful things that renders it illegitimate. We cannot, under any circumstances, have that approach to our government within the military. Now, I do understand the United States Constitution, and we have free speech, and if people feel that way about their government, they are absolutely entitled to express that opinion. I disagree with it strongly. I think our republic is very strong. We have a system for resolving our differences. We should honor and respect that system and maintain the civil society that we have. And understand that a fully functioning civil society does not mean that you win every political argument. It means that you have a chance to be heard, and that when you lose, there is a system in place that will keep our republic moving forward. And I wish people better understood that. But within the military, it's even more stark. If you serve in the military, you pledge an oath to the United States Constitution and the laws of this country. If you disagree with that Constitution and you disagree with the laws of this country so strongly that you think our government is no longer legitimate, then you have no business serving in the United States military, and you should get out now. You pledge an oath to the Constitution and to these laws. They must be upheld, and you must respect them in order to adequately serve within the military. And we have seen a rise of people who don't believe that way. So I think it is crucially important that we identify that extremism, root it out, and get it out of the military. And then, as importantly, counter-radicalization, if you will. Educate people along the way as to why you disagree without being disagreeable is a little bit understatement. But the idea that, yes, you can disagree with the laws, but that doesn't mean that you think the whole institution should be torn down, okay? You can disagree with them. You have to uphold them. And I think it's crucially important, frankly, that we educate the entire country on that point, but certainly within the military. We have three witnesses with us today who are going to help us explore these issues, and I will introduce them to speak in a moment. But before I turn it over to Mr. Rogers, I will introduce them briefly now. Dr. Audrey Kurth Cronin, who is a professor of international security and director of the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University. We have Ms. Alicia Brooks, who is the Chief of Staff for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Mr. Michael Berry, who is the General Counsel for the First Liberty Institute. I thank them all for being here, and before I turn over to them for their statements, I will turn over to Mr. Rogers, the ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to root out of the military those who actively participate in vile and violent hate groups. We cannot ask people to fight and die together under the shadow of racial hatred. But it's important to remember that extremist behavior is already prohibited by the Uniform Code of Military Justice and by each service's own regulations. It's also important to point out that we lack any concrete evidence that violent extremism is as rife in the military as some commentators claim. Since the start of FY20, 9 soldiers have been separated from the Army for misconduct where extremism was a factor. 9 out of nearly 1 million. Since 2018, 17 Marines have been separated for extremism, gang, or dissident activity. That's 17 over 3 years out of over 200,000. While I agree with my colleagues that these numbers should be 0, this is far from the largest military justice issue facing our armed services. If this committee is going to attempt to address this issue, we need to be clear about what examining extremism means. Over the past few years, other committees have grappled with this issue of extremism and domestic terrorism. They run into the same problem over and over, the First Amendment. Service members are entitled to First Amendment rights when speaking out of uniform and in compliance with regulations. Frankly, service members have more free speech rights than most people may realize. They may worship freely, peacefully assemble, espouse political views, and engage with civic organizations. Legislative attempts to further crack down on domestic terrorism is going to run headlong into the First Amendment rights of our service members, and doing so may have other consequences. Earlier this year, over 150 overwhelmingly liberal organizations, including Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, and the SPLC Action, urged Congress not to expand domestic terrorism charges. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter that letter into the record. These organizations said, quote, "We urge you to oppose any new domestic terrorism charge, the creation of a list of designated domestic terrorist organizations, or other expansion of existing non-terrorism related authorities," close quote. The letter went on to say that ample tools exist to prosecute domestic terror and violent extremism, and that proposed new tools would be used against the vulnerable and political opponents in the name of national security. So what should we do to address this issue? Now, online hives of hate prey on socially isolated people. They exploit fear and vulnerability with radicalized ideology. Fortunately, military life offers an unparalleled opportunity to stop radicalization using model leaders and peers to show the way. Empowering leaders to know their units and speak face-to-face with soldiers is an exceptional method to stop radicalization before it starts. We should examine ways to encourage that interaction. I'm not naive enough to think that everyone who needs to step off the path toward violence or hatred will do so. That's why enforcing the current UCMJ prohibitions through administrative separations or court-martials will remain an appropriate response in some cases. Each service should keep track of these separations and examine them for patterns of conduct. If there's better data to be had, then we should address that in the NDAA. But anecdotes and online polls should not be our guide, nor should we rush to create large-scale political surveillance programs to monitor service members' political leanings. I hope our panel today can help us evaluate how the military's unique structure presents opportunities to address this issue within the framework of the Constitution. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. So we will start, we'll turn over to witness testimony. We'll start with Dr. Cronin. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the House Armed Services Committee, thank you for your service to our country and for the honor of testifying before you today. I come from a proud U.S. Navy family whose father and 3 brothers all served. My career has combined academic positions, including now as a distinguished professor at American University, and government service, including at the U.S. National War College, the Congressional Research Service, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. I speak from decades of experience working at the intersection of the military, technology, and extremism. And some of my testimony is based on my latest book, Power to the People, which analyzes how nefarious individuals, groups, and private militias use digital technologies. The violent extremism that erupted during the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol had a disproportionate number of current or former members of the U.S. Armed Forces leading the mob. Protecting patriotic service members who serve honorably and deserve our support, even as we mitigate violent extremism in the ranks, will be a long-term test. Educating and engaging our veterans is also vital. The speed at which people are radicalized and mobilized via digital media has ramped up. This trend is heightening extremism and will not reverse itself because it is part of a new technological environment. To meet this challenge, we must fully assess it, build a plan to address it, and institute trackable policies tailored to the digital age. So what does this mean? The most immediate problem is an absence of good data. The 2021 Capitol insurrection leaves the impression that the number of extremists in the military is increasing. Yet DoD officials repeatedly claim that the number is small. No one truly knows. No serious plan can be built without defining the scope of the problem. Second, the Department of Defense needs to build common standards and rules across all components. This means adopting a consistent definition of domestic violent extremism, identifying organizations that are dangerous, and developing a discharge code that can be tracked across all services. Third, the best way to address extremism is to put a structure in place to ensure adequate oversight and follow-through. This could either be a confirmable Assistant Secretary of Defense or a senior-level civilian. Fourth, digital literacy is a national security priority. Active duty military members should have regular training to make them less susceptible to online manipulation. Veterans should be offered it as well. This is imperative, not just for the extremist threat, but to defend against a broad range of information operations. Finally, we must recognize and address the ongoing risks of digital technology. This means better screening of open source social media and website use while protecting the constitutional rights of our members. Permission to access that information is already provided through the clearance process. The digital environment has enhanced the ability to radicalize, project power, and integrate tactical systems. In the 20th century, it required a national army to do all 3 of those things: mobilization, power projection, and systems integration. Now, terrorists, extremists, and militias can do them all. If we do not address the effects of our new digital landscape, we will never get on top of this problem. Only 2 things can truly defeat the United States Armed Forces: undermining the American people's trust and cleavages within the ranks. Every other enemy can be met with unity, determination, effectiveness, and success. Perhaps the silver lining of the horrible specter of storming the U.S. Capitol will be the resolve to address extremism in a profound and lasting way. To do that, we need comprehensive information, planning, and action to include measures that I've outlined in my testimony. Again, I thank you for the honor and privilege of being a witness at this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Brooks, you are recognized. Is your microphone on?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. My name is Alicia Brooks, and I serve as the Chief of Staff for the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm also the proud daughter of a veteran of the Korean War and the mother of a son who served in the U.S. Army for 10 years. This issue is deeply personal to me. Let me begin with two distinct points. First, the vast majority of those who serve in our armed forces have no connection to white supremacy or extremism and strive always to uphold the best traditions of our nation's democratic ideals. Second, the military has a growing problem with white supremacy and extremism because our country does. The white nationalist movement in the United States is surging and presents a serious danger to our country and its cherished institutions, threatening the morale and good order of those serving in our armed forces. This is not a new problem. SPLC has been documenting white supremacist infiltration of the military and urging officials to take action since 1986. That year, we wrote Defense Secretary Weinberger and exposed the fact that active duty Marines at Camp Lejeune were participating in paramilitary Ku Klux Klan activities and stealing military weaponry. Today, we know 1 in 5 of those arrested in connection with the deadly January 6 Capitol insurrection riots has served or is serving in the military. This is a dramatic illustration of the insufficient efforts we have made to inoculate service members against acting upon extremist ideologies. Veterans and service members are high-value recruitment targets for extremist groups. They bring social capital, legitimacy, specialized weapons training, leadership skills, and an increased capacity for violence to these groups. Over the last several years, SPLC researchers and journalists have identified dozens of former and active military personnel among the membership of some of the country's most dangerous and violent white supremacist groups. Those groups include the Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi group, and the Boogaloo Movement. In addition, the base. A number of individuals affiliated with this particular white nationalist group have military ties. SPLC has analyzed more than 80 hours of calls between base recruits and group's leadership and found that roughly 20% of the recruits claim to have military experience. SPLC has been sounding this alarm for over 30 years. Today, we are here to sound the alarm again. But we are more optimistic than ever that this President, this Secretary of Defense, and indeed this committee will devote the time and attention needed to address this problem. Our testimony includes a number of policy recommendations for the Defense Department and Congress. 1, words matter. It is impossible to overstate the importance of military leaders speaking out against hate and extremism among their troops. 2, rules matter. Consistent with the First Amendment, the Department of Defense should expand and clarify existing prohibitions against advocating for or involvement in supremacist or extremist activity. We must also expand and clearly define protections for whistleblowers, chain of command oversight responsibilities, and reporting requirements. 3, who and what our military honor matters. The Department of Defense should immediately rename the 10 U.S. Army bases named for Confederate leaders. We're aware that a study commission has begun its work, but there is no reason to wait 3 years to rename these bases. We applaud the current Marine Corps and Navy prohibitions against the display of the Confederate battle flag and other racist symbols in workspaces, offices, vehicles, and vessels. We urge the Defense Department to uniformly apply these regulations across all service branches. And finally, Support for our troops and veterans matters. We urge you to expand support services that work to de-radicalize our active duty service members and veterans re-entering civilian life. As I said earlier, this issue is deeply personal to me. My father joined a military that was desegregated before public schools were. We had a black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff before we had a black president. The military has always represented our highest ideals. That is why I was so proud when my son enlisted. As long as there is racism in the larger society, it will be incumbent upon leaders in the military to lead the way. SPLC looks forward to being of service to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barry.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and committee members, good afternoon. On behalf of First Liberty Institute, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. First Liberty Institute is a national legal organization whose mission is to defend and restore religious liberty for all Americans. I am here today to urge this committee to maintain a strong and diverse military while safeguarding our service members' constitutional rights. A truly diverse military is one that is open and welcoming to all who meet the standards of service, regardless of their religious beliefs, worldview, or political persuasion. We should reject any attempt to weaponize anti-extremism efforts against classes of people simply because those in authority disapprove of them. Instead, we should focus on eradicating true extremism from the ranks. By true extremism, I mean those who would use, threaten, or advocate violence to accomplish their objectives. I seriously doubt anyone in this hearing disagrees with the notion that there must be zero tolerance for true extremists in our armed forces. Indeed, nobody wants to see such people removed from our military more than those of us who have sworn the oath of service. But unless Congress and the Department of Defense take adequate measures to ensure First Amendment rights are safeguarded, there is a real risk that the military will fall prey to partisan politicization and needlessly expose it to the threat of litigation. Excuse me. Our service members are more than capable of handling a little diversity of opinion. I should know. When I joined the U.S. Marine Corps, I was thrust into a strange new environment in which I was surrounded by people who held attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies very different from my own. Some of them even voiced disapproval of my own lifestyle choices. But I was reassured by my superiors that this is a feature of military service, not a defect. My exposure to different and even conflicting beliefs and ideologies actually made me a better Marine, and I wouldn't trade my experiences for the world. I observed firsthand that diversity really does make our military stronger and more capable. I would proudly serve alongside anyone who earned the title of U.S. Marine, period. That is the beauty of America and of our military. No matter what our background is, what unites us is far greater than what divides us. Our military truly personifies e pluribus unum. And thankfully, those who threaten, use, or advocate violence to accomplish their objectives are rare. First Liberty fully supports efforts to remove them from the military. And the good news is that the military has mechanisms to accomplish that are more than adequate. The Uniform Code of Military Justice and our regulations and policies have prohibited extremist conduct for decades. Our military justice system routinely prosecutes violators, but we do not and cannot criminalize thoughts or beliefs just because we don't agree with them. To do so would be to violate bedrock First Amendment principles. In fact, protecting unpopular or disfavored beliefs is precisely why the First Amendment exists. Indeed, the First Amendment would be entirely unnecessary if its only role would be to defend that which needs no defense. Expanding anti-extreme efforts to punish thought or belief is risky for another reason. What is popular or favored today might actually become tomorrow's thought crime. For evidence of this, look no further than the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, or DEOMI. Several years ago, DEOMI was embroiled in scandal because it published training materials that compared those who believe in individual liberties, states' rights, and making the world a better place with the Ku Klux Klan. And the U.S. Army produced training materials that labeled evangelical Christians and Catholics as religious extremists alongside Hamas and Al-Qaeda. Never mind the fact that evangelicals and Catholics continue to comprise a majority of those serving in uniform today. Labeling religious or political beliefs that are held by tens of millions of Americans as extremist is to declare them unwelcome and unfit to serve. It's to say, Uncle Sam does not want you. It also creates a de facto de facto hostile work environment for the great many who are already serving who hold fast to those beliefs. This, in turn, has a detrimental effect on recruiting, retention, and readiness. Put differently, protecting the First Amendment is truly a matter of national security. In conclusion, the threat of extremists infiltrating our ranks is far outweighed by the threat to our Constitution if we allow partisanship and popularity to dictate policy. First Liberty encourages the Congress to hold the Department of Defense accountable to the constitutional requirements of free speech and religious freedom. We must ensure that these paragons of American virtue are not only protected, but cherished. Once again, I thank the committee for this opportunity to present testimony on this issue of utmost importance.
Thank you very much. And let me say, I wanted to mention I agree very much with what Mr. Rogers said. I don't think we need new domestic terrorism laws and no excuses for the federal government to, violate people's individual rights. But we do have a problem, and that becomes the challenge here. As I said at the outset, what is extremism? What is a legitimate political view? Certainly being a Catholic is not extremism in the United States of America. But I wanted to ask, because this is something I've wrestled with, is that is going to be in the eye of the beholder. In fact, I was struck, Mr. Berry, by your comment that we should accept people regardless of their worldview. And that's not actually true. There are certain worldviews which we're not going to accept. I mean, if your worldview is completely in line with the Nazi Party or the Ku Klux Klan or Hamas, we're not going to accept you. So we do have to make a choice here. It's not simply free speech. Say what you want, believe what you want, it's all good. We have to make a choice as a society what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. And that's where I think the debate sort of gets lost here. People are like, well, intolerance is bad. Well, no, discrimination is bad. Well, it depends on what you're discriminating against, and it depends on what you're being tolerant of. And that's what we have to sort of walk through. So I guess, Mr. Berry, I would ask, do you see what Ms. Brooks has talked about? Do you see that there is still a white nationalism problem, that there is a white supremacy problem that must be addressed?
Mr. Chairman, I actually agree with Secretary Austin when he said that 99.9% of our service members are good, honorable people who love America. And we actually have adequate laws, regulations, and policies in place to address the 0.01% who are truly causing problems and have no place in our military.
So you don't see a rise in white nationalism or anything beyond, because I'm not talking about changing laws here. We're talking about using those laws to address an issue that is in front of us.
Well, I am not aware of the actual data. I assume that the Department of Defense has that data, and if they do, they haven't published it to my knowledge. So to the extent that the numbers are, increasing, if they are increasing, then that becomes I think an enforcement problem, but not a problem of simply identifying who or what is an extremist, or more problematically, expanding that definition.
Absolutely. Dr. Cronin, I was really interested in your comments on the digital world out there, and this is a nightmare for all employers and for all individuals as well. How much are you entitled to look at what the people who work for you are doing online and then react to it? So I'm curious if you could drill down a little bit on how you see implementing that. If you're, within the military, you're trying to, root out extremist views or other things, how does that work within the context of the First Amendment if you're the United States military to look at the social media history of the people serving?
Well, I think it is very important to protect the First Amendment rights of our service members. So let me just stipulate that nothing that I would support with respect to social media would be impinging upon those rights. But at the moment, I think that the Department of Defense is finding itself less willing to look at open source material than many employers are. Many people who are just vetting interns or students even at my university when they're going to be accepted, or at any university. I think that there should be a consistent way to be on top of what is open source information about military members, and that is not currently being consistently pursued. There's an uneven degree to which our investigative services vet what is happening on open source social media, and I think that we could use more aggressive tools to be able to at least have one single policy across the Department of Defense that watches out for keywords, for example, or looks for particular memes and keeps on top of the symbology. I think the Department of Defense is falling behind in many cases and doesn't necessarily have access to the most up-to-date information that they need.
Thank you. And Ms. Brooks, I wanted to ask you sort of along the lines of what I asked Mr. Berry, because that's the challenge we have when we go after extremism. You know, those of us on the left, Democrats, tend to look at it and say, you know, if you're part of, you know, white supremacist groups, the Ku Klux Klan and all that, that's what we're going after. And then on the other side, it's like, well, no, you're just going after people who disagree with liberal orthodoxy, Catholics, evangelical Christians, or whatever. How do you, when the Southern Poverty Law Center is going after extremism, how do you draw that distinction between what is legitimate extremism and what is just sort of, you know, a legitimate conservative viewpoint?
Thank you for the question. Let's be clear that the Southern Poverty Law Center defines a hate group as an organization that, based on their own official statements or principles and the statements of their leaders, has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically based on their immutable characteristics. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is also a proud defender of the First Amendment. It's about the actions and the words of the group or the association or its leadership. To be clear, the Southern Poverty Law Center is not anti-Christian at all. That we identify people with our hate group list based on what they say and what they do. It has nothing to do with being against marriage equality. Certainly there are hundreds of churches and institutions that are anti-marriage equality that are not on our hate group list. And I would also offer that the Southern Poverty Law Center recently did a staff survey, and over 65% of the Southern Poverty Law Center staff identify as Christian. And in addition, we have people who identify with other religions, of course. So it's not about thought, it really is about action. So I think that Mr. Berry and I are in agreement. I'm certainly in agreement with Dr. Cronin that we support the First Amendment, but we do need to do something about extremism. Let me offer a definition that we use. It's from a scholar, J.M. Berger. Extremism refers to the belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the out-group. That's our definition of extremism.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berry, based on your law practice, what issues should we be on the lookout for when any potential extremism policy from the DOD?
Without an appropriate definition of extremism, Mr. Rogers, then there's a real risk that we will do violence to the First Amendment. That has been my experience in my legal practice. And when that happens, when that occurs, the real harm is to our troops and to our nation, to our readiness. The most recent available data indicates those who identify as highly religious are the most likely to join the military. And yet, if there are, as I indicated in my remarks, there are publications produced and published by the Department of Defense indicating that people who identify as evangelical Christian or Catholic or of other faith groups are at least considered possibly extremist, that you're essentially telling those who are, according to data, most likely to join our military that they're unwelcome, that they should look somewhere else.
Okay. What role do our leaders play in identifying violent extremism? What should we expect from those leaders?
Well, extremism does not grow in a vacuum. Service members are actively recruited and preyed upon. Our leaders are really the first line of defense because the military service is first and foremost a human enterprise. And so our leaders must offer a superior alternative to extremism, much in the same way that we must offer a superior alternative to a lifestyle involved in criminal gang activity and things of that nature. And when we do that, when we actually place the emphasis on the human enterprise aspect of the military, then our leaders understand that their position and roles as leaders is paramount, then those who are entrusted with special trust and confidence to defend our nation, they understand that they will be held to a higher standard. And my experience in the military has always been when you tell your young Marines or soldiers, sailors, airmen, et cetera, that you have set a high standard of conduct and expectations for them, they will rise up to that and meet that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield balance of my time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're here to determine truth, and that should be our aim, and not my truth or your truth, but the truth. We're having a committee hearing entitled Extremism in the Armed Forces. Now, why? Has this proven itself to be a major problem? And if so, we should not just have this hearing today, but we should have many others. Because if extremism is systemic, then it threatens not just the military, but our country. And it needs to be rooted out. Many people say, follow the science. Okay, then where's the data and evidence that suggests that extremism in any form is rampant, major, and systemic, and it's a problem in our services? Professor Cronin stated, the 2021 Capitol insurrection leaves the impression that the number of extremists in the military is increasing. Also stated of the 312 rioters arrested on January 6th, she stated that 34 were veterans and 3 were reservists. There are 18 million U.S. veterans. 34 were rioters. This means that 17,999,966 of us were not. 1 out of 529,000. And Professor Cronin, she attended Princeton and Oxford and Harvard. And you would think an infinitesimally small figure like 19 100,000ths of 1% is an indication of extremism on the rise? I mean, I can't believe that. The service right now, we have over 2.4 million active duty and reservists serving. 3 reservists were in the Capitol 2 months ago. 3. Literally 1 out of 800,000. The Capitol riot leaves a learned person like the professor with the impression that the extremism is on the rise in the military. I can't fathom that. And Ms. Brooks works for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Ms. Brooks, just a yes or no question for you. Has your organization named the American Legion as a hate group? You have to turn your mic on.
No. I don't believe so. I don't have the full list, sir, of hate group lists, but I will.
Okay, I found it, and it did. And how about, were you aware that the organization named the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, as a hate group?
Not on our current census, no.
Okay, you had in the past.
Yes, and I'm happy to present you with the research for the record as to why these groups.
Okay, no, that's fine. It's just a yes or no question.
Okay.
The Southern Poverty Law Center's operations and motives and credibility leave a lot to be desired. Recently, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico, NPR, and the New Yorker magazine, just to name a few, skewered the SPLC for, among other things, corruption, harassment, racism, and a widening credibility gap. These aforementioned media outlets aren't exactly known for their conservative leanings either. And you've stated emphatically in the written record that hate is on the rise. Well, enter Bob Moser. He's a former employee of the SPLC. Mr. Moser confesses he's a lifelong liberal. And in the New Yorker, he described working at the SPLC as a highly profitable scam. He worked there for 3 years, and he went on to say, and I quote, the hyperbolic fundraising appeals and the fact that though the center claimed to be effective in fighting extremism, quote unquote, hate always continued to be on the rise. More dangerous than ever with each year's report on hate groups. The SPLC making hate pay. It sounds like without hate, y'all don't get paid. Members, look, let's look at the data we do have. Our office reached out to all 4 branches of the service and asked one simple question. How many members of your branch were separated last year due to extremist activities? The Marine Corps gave us the data. Out of 222,000 current and active duty reservists and active duty Marines, a total of 4 were separated last year for extremist activity, leaving us once again with an infinitesimally tiny figure of of 1 out of 55,475. This isn't a hearing about the readiness of our armed forces. It's nothing more, unfortunately, than political theater. We should be addressing things we know the military needs, maintaining and modernizing a nuclear triad that's falling apart, whether or not we're going to match the 7% increase that a resurgent and aggressive China is proposing, how best to meet the threat of Russia, Iran, North Korea, to name a few. What about our posturing in the posture of forces in the Middle East with a May 1st deadline fast approaching? And
The gentleman's
personnel-wise,
time has
how about-
expired. The gentleman's time has expired. And I will point out, we have had hearings on all of those topics that the gentleman just listed, just last week, as a matter of fact. So the false choice, the idea that because we paused for one moment to have a hearing on extremism in the military, we're ignoring all of this other stuff, is simply ludicrous. We have had hearings on every single one of those issues just listed, and we will continue to have those hearings. Second, I will just point out a couple of simple little math issues. 20% of the people that have been arrested from the Capitol Hill riots had a history of serving in the military, one way or the other. To then say that, well, those are the only people in the military that could possibly be involved in extremism is simply logically absurd, and I'm sure the gentleman would recognize that. We don't know for sure how large the problem is. That's why we're having the hearing. That's why we're having the conversation. And part of this is also to bring people in who have differing views. We have Mr. Berry from his organization. We have Ms. Brooks from her organizations, because we want to have a robust debate on the subject to determine how large the problem is. So that's the purpose of a hearing. I guess the question is there enough evidence out there to warrant a further examination? Well, I don't think we should have had 1% of the people storming the U.S. Capitol having served in the military. That we had 20% is cause to go, maybe we should look and see what else is there. That is the purpose of a hearing and the purpose of political dialogue. And just because it doesn't 100% line up with your worldview doesn't mean that we don't get to talk about it. So we are going to talk about it. Mr. Langevin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad you set the record straight, because I was troubled by some of the previous comments, and let me respectfully disagree with my colleague who was speaking before that, Mr. Fallon, that I don't see any of this as political theater. It is a fact that we have a problem with some of the actions and the views expressed by members of the military are out there, and it can have a very corrosive effect. And we want to make sure that we address this and nip it in the bud so that it doesn't spread or corrode further. So, one of the few institutions of government that still enjoy a high degree of respect among the general population, the public, is our military. And thankfully, the members of the public still have high confidence in our men and women in uniform. It's important to note that. In fact, obviously, it's my understanding, everything I have seen, whether it's polls or statistics, that service members are considered highly credible sources on social media. So, Dr. Cronin, would you agree with that assessment? If when service members spread misinformation online, what impact does that have on society?
I think that the views of service members are always given much more weight than those of the general population, largely because they've gone through specialized training. They are an admirable subset of our American community, and I think that they can have extra emphasis and extra weight to the things that they put on social media. I'd also like to say, sir, that terrorism is a danger that arises from very small numbers. And so I think looking at the entire number of people within any organization as any sort of an indicator of what the threat of terrorism or extremism is would not be a rigorous way to approach it.
Okay. What metrics can you use to measure the impact of mis and disinformation on service members?
Well, we don't have very good metrics yet. This is one of the reasons why I'm very grateful that this committee is having this hearing, because I think that the Department of Defense is not consistently tracking exactly what those metrics are. So I cannot give you a good answer, Mr. Elected.
Okay. And Dr. Cronin, what tools or methods can the Department of Defense adopt from other federal agencies, academic institutions, or counter-radicalization organizations to make service members more resilient against extremist information campaigns?
I think that there is a wealth of new types of tools that would be of great use to the Department of Defense. We can go to the FBI and use the FBI database across the entire department. There are allies who have engaged in excellent de-radicalization programs that we should be consulting in order to learn how best to not just to force people out of the service, that should be the last resort, but to make sure that they're resilient to the kinds of approaches that are made to them. One of the problems, and it's increasing in our current technological environment, is that members of the military and former members of the military, we must also talk about our veterans, they are particularly valuable to extremist groups and they are targeted for recruitment. And this is indeed becoming an increasing problem.
Thank you. My next question, I'm encouraged by the recent steps the Department of Defense has taken to address extremism in the ranks, but a one-time stand down or annual PowerPoint training isn't enough, in my opinion. So, Dr. Cronin, Ms. Brooks, how can the military implement a program that avoids the pitfalls of check-the-box training to produce sustained success in limiting extremism? Maybe we start with Ms. Brooks.
Thank you so much for the question. We completely agree. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a one-time, one and done. And certainly it's more than a PowerPoint presentation. We're encouraged by the Secretary of Defense's call for the stand down as an initial conversation, initial starting point. We're also very grateful to the chairman and this committee for what we understand is a full committee hearing has not been done on this topic ever, if at all. So we appreciate that. And we see this as a beginning of an ongoing conversation, just like the rest of the country. To be clear, the military, as Dr. Cronin has alluded to, is no different than any other segment of society. As we continue as a country to...
And I apologize, Ms. Brooks. The gentleman's time has expired. I should have explained that up front.
Oh.
A lot of times they throw questions at you and there's 10 seconds left and then but we try to keep the time because we have a lot of members who want to get in.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panelists for being with us today. And Mr. Berry, I greatly appreciate your Marine JAG service. It's critically important that our service members have one overarching loyalty, and that is to protecting the citizens of the United States in her interest. The DoD has various directives that guide the political activity of its members and can punish extremist behavior under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which I appreciate as a former JAG officer myself and also the father of a current JAG officer. I want your assessment as to whether we need additional legislation or can we rely on the guidelines we have now and the Uniform Code of Military Justice without additional legislation.
Thank you, Congressman. I believe that the existing guidelines are adequate as long as we maintain an appropriate definition of what extremism is. And I, again, go back to my earlier definition, which is anyone who uses, threatens, or advocates violence to accomplish their objectives. There's nobody that I'm aware of who wants to see those people serving in our military. But beyond that, we have Uniform Code of Military Justice provisions that address violence, that address contemptuous language towards superiors and official. We have Uniform Code of Military Justice provisions that address conduct unbecoming. And we also have DoD regulations. DoD Instruction 1325.06 is one that comes to mind to address prohibited dissident activity as well. So again, it's the existing regulations and policies are adequate. And if the Congress decides that it wants to amend that, then my strong encouragement would be to do so in a manner that ensures robust protection for the First Amendment. Nothing will erode public trust and confidence in our military faster than the belief, whether perception or reality, but the belief that the military no longer protects First Amendment rights for its service members.
And thank you for that response. And in particular, thank you for citing the definition of violence. I think that's so critical, and so that it's not too broadly interpreted. I also, for you, I'm grateful that I represent Fort Jackson, which is the home of the Army's great Drill Sergeant Academy. Every drill sergeant in the Army is trained at Fort Jackson. They do an exemplary job and an important first step in shaping our new recruits with the wonderful opportunities they have of military service. Do you have any suggestions on how they can identify extremism and address potential cases within the brief 2 to 3 months that they have to work with the recruits?
Mr. Wilson, I did not have the privilege of going through basic training at Fort Jackson, although I have taught at the other fine institution you have there, the Army Chaplain School. But I will say, based on my own experience when I was on active duty in the Marine Corps, 2 phrases that I heard frequently were protect what you've earned and police your own, right? In other words, the institution of the military is one that has a proud heritage, and it's when we begin to, I believe I heard somebody use the phrase earlier, ostracization or social isolationism. Those are I think those are when service members become very susceptible to being recruited away to join, criminal gang activity or even radicalized via extremism. In fact, that's what we saw in the wars on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's how local citizens became radicalized as well, is they were isolated and eventually won over by the extremists and the radicals. The same thing can happen in our military. So I go back to one of my earlier responses. It's a leadership issue. This is and always will be a leadership issue. And when you combine good leadership with sound enforcement of existing law and policy, I think we'll begin to see positive results and outcomes.
And I'm really grateful, Mr. Berry, too, that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has made it a priority to hold accountable anybody who broke the law on January the 6th. We should not have people who support violence in the military. Additionally, but I'm concerned that there may be efforts to have a by name list of prohibited organizations. What is your view about developing lists?
I do believe that lists can be dangerous. As I stated in my earlier remarks, sir, labeling evangelical Christians and Catholics as extremists is opening Pandora's box.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And I share your concern. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Spear is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's really important for us to recognize that we were looking at this issue long before January 6th. In fact, last February, the Military Personnel Subcommittee held a hearing entitled Alarming Incidents of White Supremacy in the Military, How to Stop It. And as part of the NDAA last year, all of us supported an amendment to create a UCMJ article on violent extremism, and the amendment to create a person within the Inspector General's office, a deputy Inspector General, to deal with the issue of both diversity and extremism. So this has more to do with just looking at this issue in the cold light of day. Let me go to you, Ms. Brooks. The DoD policy currently prohibits active participation and active advocacy of white supremacy and violent extremism, but it does not prohibit membership in violent extremist organizations. We revisit this policy and prohibit membership in violent extremist organizations that seek to overthrow the government or start a race war.
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, there was a break in the Zoom, so I didn't get the question, but you're absolutely right. That is the current prohibition against membership. And that's interesting because what we're finding at the Southern Poverty Law Center is that as groups become more and more diffused, it's not as black and white to identify a member to say whether or not membership constitutes actual activity. And so we certainly support the current military prohibitions against active participation in these groups, but we don't know that it should just solely fall on membership or not, because certainly one can actively participate without being a member.
So there was a Master Sergeant Corey Reeves, who was a Colorado airman, who was a member of the Identity Europa group, which is a white supremacist organization. He actually was a fundraiser in that organization and actively sought members. When that was discovered, he was reduced in rank, but not actually removed from the military. So in that case, there was active advocacy of white supremacy, and it violated the DoD policy, but there wasn't an effort to remove him until it became publicly known as a result of our hearing. Ms. Cronin, let me move to you. The security clearance adjudicative guidelines indicate that the federal agencies should not be granting security clearances to people with associations or sympathy with persons or organizations that advocate, threaten, or use force or violence, or use other illegal or unconstitutional means to overthrow the government, prevent government personnel from performing official duties, gain retribution for perceived wrongs caused by the government, and prevent others from exercising their constitutional rights. This seems pretty clear to me. All service members are supposed to be able to obtain a secret or top secret security clearance. And we expect cleared individuals to not sympathize with violent extremists. Yet, we allow military service members to be members of such organizations. Do you agree that this is a contradiction, and what should we do about it?
Yes, Ms. Spear, I strongly agree. And I think the problem is that we don't have a joining up of the UCMJ and the clearance process. We don't have a consistent way of looking at exactly how we are evaluating our service members. The degree to which these rules are enforced across different services differs greatly, and commanders tend to look on a case-by-case basis. So it is a serious problem, I believe.
And you talked about digital literacy. Do you think it's appropriate that recruiters look at the Facebook pages of potential members of the military, much like the private sector looks at the social media pages of potential employees?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's an extremely important step that we should take. It's no different from what happened in the 1990s when there was a problem with gang violence and there was an institution of examining tattoos, and the military sent out a whole set of booklets about what those tattoos were. So I think we should be doing the same thing in our current technological environment and looking at people's digital behavior.
I think
you.
the lady, my time has expired.
Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Berry, I wanted to go to you. I know that as we talk about the gravity of the allegations of extremism within the ranks of the military, this is an extraordinarily serious charge, and I think it's good that we have the discussion about this. I want to emphasize that our military are highly professional, highly trained, highly motivated, and highly capable. And the overwhelming majority of people that are in our United States military do so out of a sense of patriotism, out of a sense of servant leadership. So I think we have to be very careful about how we characterize this particular effort. I want to make sure we get after extremism in the ranks. No two ways about it. It is a corrosive force within our ranks wherever it exists. But I want to make sure that as we look to root out extremism, we don't fall into a self-fulfilling prophecy where leaders look to quell freedom of expression within the ranks. Ultimately, in doing that, I think you sow even potentially more extremism. So let me get your perspective on this. I want to make sure that we look at having a carefully vetted and curated effort that's done by a central, nonpartisan authority to make sure that we look at truly what is extremism. As you point out, what is true extremism? And I fear that if we do it any other way, we're going to fall victim to the whims and be subject to the ideology of local commanders, or at worst, political appointees, where things become a political measure metric. Mr. Berry, I want you to give us your thoughts. As a Marine yourself, you understand the very basic power of the command structure and what that has on a service member's thought processes if they start labeling wrong thoughts or wrong beliefs. Extremism, as you know, is a widely defined term. Who gets to decide where we cross from personal or religious belief into a disagreed upon extremist belief is the central mantra of what has to be addressed with this. It can be a slippery slope if we're not very careful that we could potentially never undo. How, in your estimation, are we ensuring that political ideology of our leadership doesn't quell open and honest dialogue within the ranks?
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. I think that is the challenge that's before us and before our leadership. And I do want to be clear that I certainly can speak from my experiences, but I am here today speaking in my civilian capacity and not on behalf of the Department of Defense. But I will say that my background is as a litigator. So I come to this issue from that perspective of having looked at and practiced many years of representing service members, and both in uniform and now in my civilian capacity. And I think if there's anything that the case law teaches us, it is the importance and just how vital it is that we have a good working definition. I think that's the starting point. Yeah. Because if you go, we go all the way back to 1919 during the height of what at that time was a socialism scare, and you had the Supreme Court of the United States saying that somebody could be convicted for publishing literature that urged people to resist the draft. And they said because that was unpatriotic, un-American activity, and that's where we created the clear and present danger test. You fast forward to 2008, just a little over 10 years ago, and an active duty service member actually had their conviction reversed by the highest military court when they used the internet to promote their white supremacist views. And the court said that although they expressed those views, they did not actively advocate for violence. And then just a few years later, you had somebody, again, post on a social media forum that they wanted to, quote unquote, kill the president. And that one was upheld because that was advocating violence. So there you start to see the case law is creating these clear distinctions and differences. And I think that's where the policy and the law needs to be, is in reflecting those clear divisions. Because otherwise, as I've stated earlier, we risk creating such a wide net that it begins to capture things that the First Amendment and the Constitution were never intended to capture, which is what somebody believes, what God they worship, or what they look like.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe in using that case law to define what is true extremism in that understood definition? How do you believe then that should be implemented? Should it be through each individual commander? Should it be through a central, nonpartisan authority? How do you think you actually apply that?
And you have slightly less than 10 seconds to answer it.
It should be implemented very carefully through, I would prefer a nonpartisan central authority.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for gathering the information that we are not always aware of, and thanking those who serve. And as many people have mentioned, 99.9% isn't a problem. But we do understand that one person can create some tremendous issues and problems. I grew up much of the time in Tennessee, and I remember going to an amusement park called Rebel Railroad, where we had the flag, and we were just thinking as young children, not knowing, this is about South and pride. Well, as an adult, we learned something very different. You speak about removing symbols across the military, in particular the Confederate flag. Why is that important? Give us a historical perspective. Here we are in 2021. Why that's a problem?
Thank you for the question. The Southern Poverty Law Center believes that monuments and symbols to the Confederacy are harmful and prevent us from moving forward together as a country. As you know, the Confederacy stood against the Union, and in addition, the Confederacy was formed to protect and prolong the inhumane institution of chattel slavery in the United States. We believe that it is wrong for a military that embraces all people to hold up as heroes those who fought to continue the enslavement of African Americans.
Can you touch base on the original reason why many of these were adopted in terms of trying to bring the country back as one? And why is it the right time now to remove these?
Well, I guess I would say thank you for the question. And as we understand it, it's important to put into context the lost cause narrative. And as the South was being, well, former Confederate states were being brought back into the Union, it was important that they be able to see their efforts in themselves as heroic. And so that began this kind of this lost cause narrative and creating heroes out of people who fought on the side of the Confederacy. Now is the time, because we understand, we have a better and fuller understanding of our history. We're coming to grapple with our history and our past, reckon with that past, so that we can move forward together. It is always the right time to recognize history in its fullest sense and bring together all people, as Mr. Berry has said, all people and all opinions should be valued. When you have Confederate leaders, or so-called Confederate leaders, venerated in public space, it is literally a slap in the face to the ancestors of African Americans who were enslaved by these same folks. So, I would say that.
Thank you for your answer. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to point out that, kind of the concern, I think, from our side, and with respect to the way at the Southern Poverty Law Center, Southern Poverty Law Center put out an extremist file on Ben Carson. And one of the key reasons that my understanding that you did that is because his tradition.
I'm sorry, Austin, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. Can you try that again?
Views on. So the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a file on Ben Carson, naming Ben Carson.
Sorry, Zoom is not cooperating. We'll have to try to get Mr. Scott back in just a minute, so I'll go to the next. Hey, Austin, we're going to have to try to work on your connection here because it's going in and out. So I'm going to move on to Miss Stefanik. I'll take the next Republican on the list. Miss Stefanik's recognized for 5 minutes, and we'll try to get Mr. Scott back. Elise, are you with us? He's not on, sir. Okay, well, strike two. Mr. Desjardins, are you on?
Let me unmute. Now am I on?
Yes, we got you. You are recognized for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I may be going in the same direction that Mr. Scott was, but trying to zero in on how we're defining extremism, which is, as we know, a very subjective term in this discussion. I guess I would like to look a little further into some of the opinions of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Mrs. Brooks, is it true that the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, and the American College of Pediatricians have all been labeled extremist hate groups by your organization?
Thank you, sir. Yes, that is true. And I will just review again the definition for hate group. It's an organization that puts out statements or principles by its leaders that denigrate and malign an entire group of people based on their identity characteristics. It is not about being just simply anti-LGBT, but it's about going out of your way to vilify segments of the population. I would also want to correct the record.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Brooks, finish your thought.
Just want to correct that the Southern Poverty Law Center never listed VFW or the American Legion. That assertion appeared as satire in a military satire blog known as Duffel Blog.
And if we could suspend Mr. Desjardins' time for just 1 second, I really want to emphasize that point. That's why we have these hearings, is to try to get to the facts. Then we can debate what to do with them, but we can't be throwing out a bunch of misinformation. That's why we try to have these hearings to get to that point. I'm sorry, Mr. Desjardins, it is your time. Go ahead.
And I agree. Thanks for clarifying. That's a relief to know that the American Legion and VFW were not named. But the American College of Pediatricians, if they're going to be thrown in as a hate group or violent extremism, certainly that doesn't fit the definition Mr. Berry gave. Is this because of their designation on their views on transgender youth receiving hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgery?
Thank you for the question. It's not entirely based on just that alone, sir. I'm happy to get the research to you that we use to identify them as a hate group.
Okay, let's move on. How about conservative Jewish activist David Horowitz, the president of the conservative think tank, David Horowitz Freedom Center? You've designated him as a hate group? Excuse me.
Yes, sir. Let me just point out that oftentimes people point out groups that sound patriotic, sound religious, when in actuality, those very groups who use these names or these titles also promote very hateful rhetoric. Let me clear up the radical traditionalist Catholicism group that's named as a hate group, because we're often thrown that. We do not blanket.
Well, actually, let's not do that right now, if you don't mind. Let's not do that because we have limited time. How about Antifa? Has your group designated them as a hate group?
Thank you, sir. No. The definition for the Southern Poverty Law Center, again, is about hateful rhetoric or that maligns an entire group of people based on who they are. It's important to note that Antifa is not is a political group that's loosely organized. They do not target any particular group or marginalize any particular group in that manner that's consistent with our hate group list.
And I would argue that the American College of Pediatricians has not either. And the whole point of this discussion is, I agree with my colleague, Mr. Whitman, as we're looking to sources to decide what violent extremism is, we have to be very careful. And when I see groups like Southern Poverty Law Center picking and choosing, deciding what they accept as normal and abnormal, and using them as a source to define what's acceptable in our military, I think that creates a deep problem for moving forward, and we need to show consistency, because some of this is opinion and it's not fact. There's no room for violent extremism in our military whatsoever. It seems like we all are in agreement on that. But as we have this hearing to explore what these definitions should be, I think we need to use sources that are fair across the board. And violent extremism, as defined by Mr. Berry, was very good. But I think your organization kind of cherry picks and chooses. You have all right-wing groups listed as hate groups. You have no left-wing groups, to my knowledge, and we need consistency and bipartisanship as we move forward in this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
May I, sir?
Please.
The Southern Poverty Law Center's listing does not require acts of violence to land on the hate group list. I just want to be clear. We're in a complete agreement with Mr. Berry's definition about violent extremists. You should not conflate the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate census with a list of violent extremist groups, as it says on our website.
Mr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by just really thanking you for elevating this issue to a full committee hearing. I think the issue is so important, and regardless of what percentage of the armed forces, subscribe or are members in extremist organizations, the fact that there is one, I think, justifies this hearing at this level. So thank you. I appreciate this hearing. The topic is extremism in the military. I think we can all agree that violent activity is already prohibited under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I think most of us will agree and accept that participating in extremist organizations is also prohibited by most service regulations. Participating meaning things like attending speeches or fundraising or recruiting. But my concern goes to membership. And I recognize that there are First Amendment issues. I recognize that service members enjoy constitutional rights, but I also know that those rights are applied differently in the military context. First Amendment, for example, I cannot engage in political speech when I'm in uniform. Fourth Amendment, a commander has much more latitude in searching my living area on an installation than the local police do my private residence in Bowie, Maryland. The Sixth Amendment, the Supreme Court has said that right to jury trial doesn't apply. And my concern with membership is twofold. One, if I'm a member of an extremist organization, membership alone serves to undermine the morale, the readiness, and unit cohesion, if not even the discipline of that unit. Membership is also a concern of mine because if I'm a member of an extremist organization, I now get to benefit from the skills training, the leadership training, that the military provides. So my question is really straightforward, and I'll start with Ms. Brooks. Does the First Amendment protect membership in an extremist organization for a member of the military?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Brown, and thank you for your leadership on the Confederate monuments issue. We appreciate that. Yes, they do have First Amendment protections. As the current prohibition against activities are stated kind of in military regulations, it really falls on whether or not they're engaged actively or actively participating and acting on that membership. As you know, someone could sign up in a listserv and become a member. So it really does require their active participation.
And Dr. Cronin, your thoughts on that?
Yes, sir. I agree completely about the description of the limitations to rights that other people do not experience. So if you're in the military, you do have some limitations upon your First Amendment rights. But the kind of concerning activity that I'm talking about involves advocating the overthrow of our government. And so groups that advocate the overthrow of our government, anyone who is involved in membership of those groups cannot also be protecting the U.S. Constitution under their oath. So to me, it seems to me that there's a very clear contradiction there. And Congress needs to step into that part of this story.
For you, Mr. Barry?
Yes, sir, Mr. Congressman. Membership in an organization alone establishes a strong presumption, right? And I think the question then is, what does that organization of which someone is a member, what do they actually espouse or advocate? And as I've stated before, if they're advocating violence to accomplish their objectives, then the person who's a member has no place in our military. If they're merely advocating ideas, then I think that becomes a slippery slope. We don't want to punish thoughts, ideas, or beliefs. We want to punish conduct, and that's what our courts have consistently held.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, with what little time I have left, I'll yield it back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to give Mr. Scott another try. Austin, are you with us?
Thank you, Chairman. I hope this is better. I'm actually on a Wi-Fi now instead of a digital connection. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We got you.
Okay. So one is I do think that this is an important hearing, but I don't think the problem is as big as some people make it out to be. But it's kind of a little bit of poison in the water is too much poison in the water, in my opinion. My concern is, what is the definition of extremism? And as I was saying earlier, and this goes to Ms. Brooks with the Southern Poverty Law Center, your organization posted an extremist file on Dr. Ben Carson. Can you tell me why the Southern Poverty Law Center labeled Ben Carson as an extremist?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the Southern Poverty Law Center did initially identify Mr. Carson and placed him on our extremist list. as you actually probably also know, we removed him from the extremist list. So I don't.
With all due respect, ma'am, you didn't necessarily apologize to him. You put out a list of his statements that, you know, he said marriage is between a man and a woman. It's a well-established pillar of society, and no group, be they gays, be they North American Man-Boy Association group, be they people who they believe in, it doesn't matter what they are. They don't get to change the definition. I mean, he believes things that you disagree with, is the bottom line. Is that correct?
Again, I could just point you back to our hate group list. So let me just be clear that we appreciate being a part of this hearing as we are discussing the rise in white supremacy and white nationalism within the U.S. military. We are not here to debate the range of the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group list. If we are focusing, if we are focusing in on violent extremists in the military, let us then do that and not take the opportunity to have hits against the center's
ma'am,
list.
with all due respect, ma'am, the definition of the hearing is extremism in the armed services, is my understanding, not white supremacy in the armed services. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? It is extremism in the armed services.
That is correct, and I do want to make one thing clear. I invited Ms. Brooks here. We invited Ms. Brooks here to get her perspective. I want to make it 100% clear. We're not designating the Southern Poverty Law Center as being in charge of deciding what to do about extremism in the military. We're taking their viewpoints as we take many viewpoints. They're not going to be running things, or all of their decisions are not what's going to be implemented. So that's why they're here, is to have that conversation, to lend their expertise on the subject of extremism, and for us to learn.
Fair enough. Fair enough, Mr. Chairman. I'll move on to another subject, and this is just something that I point out to the committee is one of my primary concerns that I'm seeing in not just in the military, but in a lot of areas. You know, someone who maybe they posted something when they were angry 10 years past, and then that today is being used as a reason to terminate them from their positions. And so I think we need to be very careful that we don't take an individual statement or an individual action that someone takes, unless that action creates harm or actually encompasses violence, and cancel somebody's military career and attack their character with an individual statement or an individual action that somebody took or posted online. And I'm very concerned that we're seeing people through all walks of society lose their jobs and other things simply because of a Facebook post or some other post that was made when somebody was mad. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to get to a better Wi-Fi connection.
Well, thank you. And I think those perspectives, and I think that this is precisely why we're having this hearing. And I am very sympathetic with the remarks that Mr. Scott just made. We're doing this because this isn't easy. That's exactly why we're doing this. Yet, without question, extremism on the right and extremism on the left has risen up and become violent in both instances and created problems, okay? At the same time, yes, you have people who then dumb down extremism to be, that person disagrees with me, therefore I'm going to call them an extremist and try to make sure that they don't get a chance to speak, okay? And how we walk between those two things in our society right now is really difficult, and it is clearly impacting our military. Clearly. Whether you want to say, you come from the perspective there's too much extremism in the military, white supremacy is rampant, it's making it difficult for diversity, or you want to come from the other side and say that people are, the thought police are out there. You can't say or do anything. No matter which side you come at, you should acknowledge this is a problem for the good order and discipline in our military that we need to figure out how to better handle. And that is what I'm hoping we'll be able to accomplish today. I have Ms. Sherrill next on the list.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And this has been a very interesting hearing, and certainly I've not agreed with every member, but I do appreciate those who expressed their opinions respectfully and thoughtfully, as we generally do in this committee. It's something that I most like about this committee compared to some of my other ones. I just want to talk a little bit and address something quickly, since we are talking about how to handle this and truth, and want to make sure that we are dealing with the appropriate facts. I'm afraid that Mr. Berry might have left a false impression about some of the Army training. I think that, and he was referred to it about 3 times in saying that the Army had a doctrine against Catholics or evangelicals. I think what he's talking about is a slide that was used several years ago at a briefing for the Army Reserves Unit in Pennsylvania. And I know it was widely reported, but I do just want to make sure people on this committee are aware that an Army spokesperson said that the person who created and presented that slideshow was not actually a subject matter expert, that there was a complaint about it. Upon receiving a single complaint, that person apologized and deleted the slide, that the slide itself was not produced by the Army. It's not part of policy or doctrine. The Army has stated that, and the Archdiocese also said that that training seems to have been an isolated incident. So certainly it should never have happened, but it is not an Army policy or doctrine, as far as I understand it, to put those groups out or compare those groups to hate groups. I think also when we're looking at this, I agree with the chairman, and I actually agree with the majority of people who've spoken today, that we have to be very, very careful about what we call extremism and how we define it. But we also, it is the military. And we do have to make sure that as people are taking an oath to our Constitution, that they can uphold that oath. And certainly there are various groups that would undermine the beliefs of this nation, the beliefs of people in this country, and the values enshrined in the Constitution. And you really cannot serve in our military if you hold beliefs that really would support undermining our Constitution. So there are, of course, various military regulations and directives that do place limits on service members' rights, such as Article 88, contempt towards officials, Article 92, failure to obey an order or regulation, Article 133, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, and Article 134. So we do know that when you join the military, you have rights, but you also have responsibilities that you need to uphold for our nation. I think this has been an important hearing, and I also agree with those. I'm not sure. I suspect that some of the extremist views are not widely held in our military, but it does seem by some reporting that they are growing, that up from around 20% of military members who'd seen evidence of extremist views, we now are up in the 30s, and I certainly think we do need more information to understand the threat. However, in speaking to the SecDef and speaking to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, their opinion is, and I think Representative Scott said it, just a little poison in the water is too much poison in the water. So we certainly have to make sure we're rooting that out. And I guess with that in mind, there's been a lot of discussion about those with extremist views going on special social media platforms or media outlets, particularly as they are banned from more popular platforms like Twitter or Facebook. So these extremist platforms are assuredly part of the problem, as they facilitate an indoctrination process into extremist ideology that can culminate in violence. And the military has been able to ban service members from accessing certain social media platforms due to national security concerns related to data being leaked to our adversaries. I'd like to ask our panelists, do you see a benefit in the military banning service members from accessing certain social and media platforms favored by some of our extremist groups on national security grounds? And can you discuss in some detail, if you would, what you see as the First Amendment issues? Because I do think these are thorny problems, and I do appreciate the concerns presented today about First Amendment issues. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that's an interesting proposition. Certainly, as you know, there have been platforms, or there are platforms that currently exist for the express purpose of advancing violent extremism. So I think that's very, very interesting, and for the committee to further contemplate, or the military leadership to contemplate whether or not that might be a line in the sand, if a platform was created for that express purpose.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Mr. Gallagher is recognized next.
Thank you. Thank you. Honestly, I would say based on my own experience in the Marine Corps, it would shock me to learn that extremism, whether it's Salafi jihadism or neo-Nazism, is endemic in the military. And, when I was downrange, I served in diverse units, and all that really mattered, particularly in a combat zone, was whether you as a Marine could do the job. In other words, the Marine Corps seemed not to judge people by the color of their skin, but rather by actions that you could actually quantify, like pull-ups, marksmanship, or a general ability to endure pain, which is a key part of being a Marine. So I guess I could be wrong. I guess the Marine Corps could be filled with extremists on a level that I did not appreciate before. But we have no DoD witnesses here to help us make sense of that, and I have not seen data from any of our panelists that would help me make sense of this. We seem to lack an agreed upon baseline, in fact, from which we could even measure an increase or decrease in extremism. We can't even agree on a definition of extremism. And in the absence of data, and in the absence of DoD witnesses, I fear we're left making somewhat wild suppositions based on our ideological priors, which is never a good place to be. So some recent data that are worth paying attention to and that do concern me. Last month, the Reagan Institute released new polling that shows public trust in the military has declined for the second consecutive year, down from 70% in 2018 to 56% today. So confidence in the military is down amongst all subgroups, including men, women, older and younger Americans, and veterans. And in particular, since 2018, confidence in the military is down 17 points for Republicans and 19 points for independents. So while we can all agree that violent extremism of any kind has no place in our nation and certainly no place in the military, I am increasingly concerned that any popular perceptions that the military is taking sides in political disputes or targeting one particular political faction or the other could exacerbate this trend of growing lack of confidence in the military. Moreover, it is a matter of fact that there's an active propaganda campaign being prosecuted by the Chinese Communist Party right now, attempting to portray our entire country as an evil racist hellscape with no authority to lecture them on human rights. And so I want to be sensitive about playing into our competitors' hands on that front, and sensitive to anything that might undermine our ability to fight and win wars in the future. And with that in mind, Mr. Berry, could you please elaborate on what, if any, long-term danger you see posed by the loss of public confidence in the military? What could be some of the consequences in terms of military readiness, for example?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Quite simply, the danger is if people lose trust and confidence in the military, then America's mothers and fathers stop sending their sons and daughters to join the military. As someone who has served, I and you both probably recognize the old saying that the military is a young man's game, notwithstanding our ability to endure pain. It is very much a young person's game, and we have to have young people who are willing to step up, make selfless service and sacrifice a part of their lives, and to be willing to to sacrifice many of the freedoms that young people in this country enjoy in order to serve our great nation. And if they start hearing the message that either that the military has become a victim of partisan politics, or that it has become overly infiltrated with extremists and radicals, then they'll stop joining. And one more threat to that is simply telling people of entire classes of citizens that they're unwelcome to serve in the military because of their beliefs and or because of their background. So I think that's the real danger to readiness is people will stop joining the military. We're going to start to see our numbers plummet.
And in the few seconds I have left, Dr. Cronin, is there an obvious, fair data set we could draw upon to get at this thorny issue? What makes the most sense, in your opinion?
Not yet. And that is one of the main reasons why I think this is a very important hearing. And let me just say that my many years of serving at the National War College also gave me considerable insight and considerable loyalty to the military and concern to make sure that their image within the American public is not undermined by things like the many indictments that are coming out against current and former military who were involved on January 6th.
Thank you. I yield my 3 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Ms. Houlihan is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for joining us today. I have a couple of questions, and I do want to associate myself with Mr. Gallagher's remarks about the importance of data. And I hope that by having this sort of a conversation, this kind of a hearing, and exposing the fact that we need to all be, singing from the same hymnal and understanding what the data is, that we end up with, as a consequence, having a way to measure what matters, which is whether or not this is an issue that we can get our teeth around and work to address. My first question is for Dr. Cronin, and like many on the committee and like you as well, I am disturbed about the destructive nature of disinformation, which definitely has a corrosive effect on this democracy and on our service members. And in addition to being a veteran, I'm also a former teacher. And so I believe that we need to invest in foundational literacy, but also in functional literacy, which includes being able to figure out what is fact and what isn't fact, and to be able to ask critical questions about sourcing. So I'm trying to understand what the possibilities are for implementing an annual training of digital literacy and cyber citizenship for our service members as an opportunity to teach our forces how to analyze and evaluate sources to determine whether that information is accurate or if it has been manipulated. I was hoping you could share what other types of training methods the DoD might be able to benefit from to better educate our service members and better equip them with the tools to be able to be responsible cyber citizens.
Yes, digital literacy is a serious national security issue now, and we need to increase their ability to be discriminating when they're on digital platforms and on social media. So I think this is an extremely important part of the answer. Right now, there's very little training except with respect to certain specific types of data. We spent a lot of time understanding what ISIS was doing and trying to look at the links between what radical Islamist jihadists were doing, and yet we haven't looked at the kinds of things that can be concerning when it comes to the same sorts of recruitment techniques that the jihadists were using. Now, I am not drawing a parallel between them and the problem we're talking about now, only about the means. And the digital means are I think, a very serious vulnerability because they're undermining, I think, the strength of our force.
And so are there any other sort of training methods that you can think of that are maybe being effectively used in other spaces that we could ask for and implement in the DoD?
Yes, ma'am. There are very good civic digital training methods that are being put together in a number of different. There's the New America Foundation has a new initiative on this subject. We can also go to our allies. The Scandinavians are extraordinarily good at digital literacy. If we were to talk to the Finns or the Swedes or the Norwegians and the Baltic states, we would really learn a lot about practices that we could help train our members with.
Really interesting, and I appreciate that. And my office will definitely take a look at that. And with my remaining time, I have a question for Mr. Berry, a follow-up question. I really appreciated you spending some time going over the language and references in the UCMJ regarding violence and various articles. I'm not a lawyer, just a veteran. And I really appreciated that you said that we should have good working definitions in the UCMJ. But in my cursory understanding and in taking a look, I saw articles regarding mutiny and sedition and conduct unbecoming, but I didn't see any specific references to domestic terrorism. To your knowledge, does the UCMJ refer specifically to domestic terrorism? If so, in what ways? And if so, why not, do you think?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I don't believe the UCMJ explicitly references the phrase domestic terrorism. However, that is not to say that there are not adequate measures that our military prosecutors can use to get to any alleged acts of domestic terror. We can actually incorporate federal criminal offenses that are defined by Congress for purposes of DOJ prosecution, et cetera. Those can actually be incorporated into a military prosecution if the elements are satisfied, and if there's not a specific UCMJ provision that addresses that particular crime or alleged crime. So I guess
just to be clear, because I only have 20 more seconds, is it your position that because it's not there, that there are other things that cover it? And if I just am having a hard time reconciling the fact that things are there for a purpose. I was raised to understand contracts exist so that you have a set of understandings between you of what is under contract and what is signed.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired.
No problem. I appreciate it,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gates is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent the district that has the highest concentration of active military in the country, and respectfully, it is on their behalf that I would categorize this hearing as total nonsense. Today, the Chinese Communist Party is building aircraft carriers and jets that every member of this committee knows threaten to close or eliminate the capability gap. North Korea is perfecting the ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. Cartels are hunting the next trafficking routes. And here we are, hunting, in the words of one of the witnesses, memes and keywords. Today, the House Armed Services Committee is engaged in a review of constitutionally protected expression by our troops. How utterly weak of us. No wonder the Chinese Communist Party continues to gain ground. The entire purpose of this hearing is not what the chairman said. It is to gaslight the targeting of U.S. military patriots who do not share pre-approved politics. This is not about extremism. It is not about white supremacy. It is about woke supremacy. It is about converting the military from an apolitical institution to an institution controlled by the political left. Today, instead of working together, we are gathered having a hearing designed to tear us apart, to try to get us to view our fellow countrymen and women who protect us as somehow evil or dangerous or a cancer to be exorcised. The U.S. military is the most diverse organization in our entire country. Men and women, Christians and Jews, Hindus, Muslims, queer and straight, every last one of them patriots with a united common purpose to protect and defend the United States of America. As we've noted, Secretary Austin said 99% of our service members believe in the oath that they swore to, and I believe that too. But there is a difference between weeding out bad apples who should be removed from the ranks and using the charge of extremism to stigmatize different opinions. And increasingly, extremism is a euphemism that Democrats are using when they're talking about conservatives, Republicans, and the group they hate most, Trump supporters. As one of our witnesses today, we have a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center. This group called the Family Research Council a hate group for its opposition to same-sex marriages. The SPLC's designation of others caused a deranged leftist to try to shoot up the Family Research Council's headquarters. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a hate group. They even smeared Dr. Ben Carson. So today, we're literally being lectured on extremism by a hate group and other witnesses who are looking to hawk their books. Recent members of our armed forces have been threatened with being chartered or chaptered out or detained by DHS for possessing hate imagery. Does having a Pepe the Frog meme somewhere on your phone make you a dangerous extremist? Is it now included in the list of hate symbols distributed right alongside neo-Nazi symbols? How ludicrous. But I guess it's to be expected. After all, the left never finds blame in its own ranks. The FBI would rather investigate garage pulls than Antifa. Firebombing a federal courthouse is small fries compared to Jussie Smollett. In 2019, West Point concluded an investigation into whether or not cadets were making white power hand gestures during an Army-Navy football game. It turns out they were not. They were playing something called the circle game, but they were doxxed anyway. And after an investigation was concluded, the OK gesture was added to the ADL's hate on display database. How long until Make America Great Again hats are considered an extremist symbol? How long until Catholic or pro-life groups or those who believe in two genders are too extreme for the ruling woketopians? Today is about nothing more than cancel culture coming for our military, and it is disgusting. It is about power, and we ought to tread carefully because our fellow Americans do not take kindly to this type of tyranny. I have no questions for the witnesses. This hearing is a joke, and I yield back.
Well, I respectfully disagree with the gentleman strongly. I think this is an important hearing and a fact-finding hearing that we need to have. But gentleman certainly is entitled to his opinion. With that, is Ms. Hodkin, has Ms. Hodkin returned? Okay, if not, then Ms. Escobar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just say a couple words in response to my colleague who really just tried to demean the purpose of this hearing. I'm sure he's no longer on. But I also want to say to some of my Republican colleagues, sir, I have the floor. I'd also like to say to some of my other Republican colleagues who expressed concern, legitimate concern, about how we do this, that I'm with you. And I do think it is really important that we do this carefully and that we do this in a serious way. Violent extremism is not a joke. Many of us personally lived through the consequences of it on January 6th. My community, El Paso, Texas, lived through it on August 3rd of 2019. This is taking people's lives. It is creating incredible turmoil. And so it's very important that we approach this with the seriousness that it deserves. And so what I'd like to ask Ms. Cronin, we've talked a lot about the absence of data, and when we don't have data, then that frequently becomes an excuse for inaction. And so really would love just some very specific suggestions from you on how you think we can begin to tackle the absence of the data. What are some things that Congress can do, some kind of key steps, so that we can really wrap our arms around the depth of the challenge that we have before us and identify opportunities to do better and identify areas where we are really failing?
Yes, ma'am. I think that the data is the most important question. If we keep ping-ponging back and forth between us as to what we mean and what's the status of the problem, there's no way that you can answer that question unless you have data. So the kinds of data that the Department of Defense might consider putting into place would be to use the Command Climate Survey, for example, to pull out the data that may relate to this question. To add an additional question to the Command Climate Survey would be another way that we could get around it. To add a discharge code that includes extremism among the reasons for discharge. Right now, it's different from different services, so there isn't any way to really know. The only kind of data that is reported to Congress is data that arises of its own. So we don't have a way to categorize it and to collect it rigorously. But those are three ideas that I would have.
And would you, one of the things that I and many of my other colleagues have been working on, not just within the services, but across the board in government, is increasing diversity, because diversity matters. And much of domestic terrorism and violent extremism can be rooted and linked back to white nationalism, racism, bigotry. And so the lack of diversity at the very top of the military, I believe, plays a role, unfortunately, in perpetuating some the environment where it can flourish. Do you see a link there? I would love to know your thoughts on that.
I'm not sure about the link because we don't have the data. I will say that I am very strongly in favor of increasing diversity at the senior ranks within the Department of Defense. I'm a girl who wanted to join the Navy, and there were no opportunities at the time. So that was not a pathway that was open to me. So I think that increasing the diversity in the senior levels of our services will help all of us and will help the services as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I only have about 30 seconds left, so I will yield back, Mr. Chairman. But I will just once again say that I really do appreciate colleagues on both sides of the aisle who are willing to tackle this issue with the seriousness that it deserves. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Bacon is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Mrs. Cronin, Ms. Brooks, Mr. Berry for being here today and the discussion we're having. My question evolves around this. First of all, we should make clear, and we do, and we need to do it repeatedly, that white nationalism is repugnant, and some of the views of groups where they're embracing anarchy or anti-government views are also repugnant. The way it comes across to me, though, in the last 3 or 4 months, we're talking about the military and extremism, that is the only focus, or that's the way it's perceived by many and by myself as well. Are we being selectively blind to other areas of extremism? That's going to be my question. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Just recently, we had 2 soldiers arrested for giving information to ISIS to aid ISIS in attacking our forces. So they're under arrest to probably be court-martialed. We see some of the worst cases of violence in military garrisons from Islamic extremists. We've had a whole year of Antifa kinds of things in many of our cities. I just don't hear those aspects being talked about now. So my question is, are we being too selective in this discussion? Are we ignoring other areas of extremism? Thank you.
Mr. Bacon, I've studied extremism for decades, and I've studied jihadist extremism. I've studied anti-technology extremism, left-wing extremism, as well as right-wing extremism and white nationalism and white supremacy and all of those things. So it is true that the word extremism includes more than just anti-government or white supremacist or white nationalist extremism. I think that one of the key reasons why we need a good, strong definition that is passed through Congress and that can be applied by our military and that is fair in including the kinds of actions that extremists advocate, that would help our ability to include all extremists, not just a selective category of one or another.
Thank you. And Ms. Brooks and Mr. Bear, I'll give you a chance to answer too if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. I would point the committee to the executive summary from the Office of Director of National Intelligence agreeing that there's not enough sufficient data. But I will point that the military itself, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a report on March 1, domestic violent extremism poses heightened threat in 2021. Though they recognize that there are a range of ideologies that animate extremism, they identified racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism and militia violent extremists as presenting the greatest threat. Now, this is from the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Central Intelligence. So, with the limited data that we have the report or survey results from the Military Times last year that reported over 50% of service members of color say that they witness racist or white supremacist behavior within the ranks. And to note that only a 0.5 percentage point identified Islamic terrorism or Al-Qaeda or other foreign terrorist organizations as an ongoing problem. But you're absolutely right. We're looking at extremism writ large. It just so happens to be, and the military agrees, that the greatest threat, the most present threat, is from racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia groups.
Well, let me just respond to that. And I appreciate your feedback, Ms. Brooks, because I'm not going to deny there's issues here, and we should be clear that it's and oppose it and call it what it is repugnant. But yet, most servicemen murdered in acts of extremism has not been from that. It's been from radical Islamism within the ranks or from the outside attacking people on base. So to say that when you look at fatalities and murders, that is not the case within the military ranks. Mr. Berry, would you like to follow up at all?
Yes, sir. Thank you. extremism is a cancer, right? Period. And at least as I've defined it earlier. And I've never heard anyone say, I'm okay with a little bit of cancer, or I'm okay with getting, with one type of cancer but not the other. And so I think that is part of the problem, is that when we're trying to eradicate extremism, we should not be picking winners and losers in this effort to eradicate true extremism from our military.
With that, I have 7 seconds left. Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. Ms. Hawk is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone putting this hearing together. And, when I was at the Pentagon, one of the things that really distinguished the American military from lots of other militaries that we would partner with across the world is we were willing to actually look at ourselves and reflect. We did after action reviews. We criticized ourselves internally if there was something that we didn't do right or on the mark. And so I think it's important and a healthy thing for us to look at this issue, particularly given the clearly high proportion of those who came inside the Capitol during the attack that had some sort of military background. I don't think that's cherry picking to just look at it. That's just straight numbers and data. Although I will say our data on almost anything else is indeed really poor. And it is hard to have a conversation about this when we don't have the data. And frankly, we don't have the Department of Defense here to talk through these issues. And I would offer, Mr. Chairman, that if we're going to talk about them, we shouldn't talk without them, and that we should be giving them the opportunity to talk about the breadth of the problem once they've had a full, chance to review it. Secretary Austin has been excellent on these issues, and I think it's super important that he's talking about his own personal experience, where he personally helped root out, a nest of skinheads that were in his unit. So I would just put that as a long commentary. I would also note that in the sort of 20 years since 9/11, we have worked very hard to try and identify any service members that might have links to foreign terrorist organizations. I mean, we have hunted folks down as much as we were able because it's such a risk to the force. It's such a risk to our country to have that. And we should put in at least the same level of effort as we were on that threat, which, while it did happen, was relatively small. And I think I hope it's the same in this case. I guess I would ask Ms. Cronin, you've mentioned this before, but walk us through what the Defense Department should be tracking in order to deal with this threat. I don't think that a lot of data exists out there. What should they be tracking?
Well, one of the difficulties, Ms. Lotkin, that you've highlighted in comparing the chasing down of foreign terrorists and those associated with foreign FTOs and those that would be associated with organizations in the United States is that there is no objective consideration of what organizations within the United States are beyond the pale for the military. And it's very difficult for the military to know exactly how to consistently across all the services execute a good policy in the way that they did with respect to foreign terrorist organizations, because there's no identifying domestic terrorist organizations. Now, I was responsible at the Congressional Research Service for tracking that FTO list. I understand the difficulties of that list. I also understand what the difficulties are in developing a domestic list. But I think we have to begin somewhere. Those organizations that are most advocating for the overthrow of our government should already be on some sort of a list that the military has, which is legally against the law for them to chase. And that doesn't exist right now. So that would be the first place to start, to give them some clear markers that help them to respond in a way that is consistent and fair to our military members.
And if I could, and this is where my life on the Homeland Security Committee and a hearing we had this morning is colliding with the work that we're doing here. Mr. Berry, you said that you had concerns about a list. Does it not make sense to take those organizations that we identify as using violence to further their political goals as at least a starting point of groups to look at within the service members?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I mean, it obviously makes sense to identify any group that advocates violence. Again, my earlier comment was simply meant to convey that we should be criminalizing conduct, though, not their their thoughts or their beliefs, because that's nearly impossible to do. But if a group is publicly,
But if someone affiliates with a group that has declared very clearly that they believe in using violence to further their political goals, short of violence, I agree with you, right? If someone is angry with their government, if someone has strong views about, frankly, about other people, but they stop short of advocating violence, I understand it. I see my time is up, but and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to be clear from the start. I certainly agree and associate myself with many of the comments. All forms of extremism are repugnant, whether it is communism, fascism, white extremism, Islamic extremism. They're repugnant. They should be rooted from the ranks. But there has been a lot of discussion about data here and what evidence we have that this issue is a significant issue within the United States military. And I am struggling. I have yet to hear any data or any evidence aside from anecdotal reporting in one survey. So Ms. Brooks, you stated earlier, you said that we are here today, you're here today to discuss the rise of white extremism within the military. So I want to be clear. Do you have data that shows that white extremism is on the rise within the United States military?
Thank you, sir. Yes, the research on the Southern Poverty Law Center's research, other researchers, journalists, we do have data that moves beyond anecdotal. There are some clear patterns as to when we've seen a historical rise in white nationalism or white supremacy within the military. We had one peak post the Vietnam War, and again, 9/11, and we are seeing it once again. And so you'll see.
So, Ms. Brooks, I'm sorry. In the interest of time, what numbers? Give me some numbers.
It's in our written.
How many?
It's in
what
our
services?
It's in our written.
Is it with the Army, Navy,
Sorry,
Air
Mr.
Force?
Mr. Walsh, she's attempting. Give her just a second there. Go ahead.
It's in a written testimony, sir. So, I mean, I referenced the Atomwaffen Division, I referenced the Boogaloo movement, and I referenced the base. And so those would be some concrete examples, recent examples of infiltration into the military from white supremacists or white nationalists. You'll find more details in our written testimony that's a part of the record.
No, I've looked over your testimony, and frankly, it looks, I mean, it is, there are some surveys that you mentioned, but I'm looking at some holistic, across the services, across the branches, actual numbers, and I'm just not seeing it, and I want to be open-minded to see it. I see, Ms. Slotkin, who I have enormous respect for, referenced the arrests from January 6th. Every one of them should be arrested. But if we start extrapolating those numbers, look, at the end of the day, we've talked a lot about misinformation. This is exactly what the Chinese and the Russians, as we just saw in Anchorage, Alaska, want the world and want us to believe that our military is systemically racist. I can tell you from 24 years in the military, our military is there to win wars. It is mission-based. It is mission-focused. It is, of course, there are flaws that we should always seek to improve. It is merit-based and mission-focused on who can do the job. And I was taught, and every person of color that I've been around receiving the same training teaches you that your skin color is camouflage. It's just what color of green. And I can tell you, when I was pulling people out of fire, I didn't care if they were black, white, or brown. The enemy's bullets certainly didn't care. They just cared that we're American. And actually, I didn't even care if they were American. In many cases, they were Afghan or they were Iraqi. They were fellow soldiers, fellow Marines, fellow sailors, period. And I would just for my colleagues and for our witnesses today, this notion is incredibly corrosive, can be incredibly corrosive to morale and to good discipline and order. And we need to be incredibly careful. So my next question is, which part of the military regulations that currently exist do you feel are not sufficient in or not being enforced in terms of extremism?
Thank you.
Ms. Sherrill referenced many of them, so I don't need to repeat them.
Well,
Mr. Walter,
Sure.
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to be able to reference specific parts of the UCMJ. I will say that we share a desire to make sure that the military is strong in being able to resist any impression that it is being undermined by members within it. And so if we were to gather much more rigorous data and it were to show that there was very little extremism, that would help us when it came to, and we were studying ourselves in this way, that would help us when it came to China.
I fully support that effort. Just in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, with the challenges that we're facing, with ships being built 5-to-1, more being launched into space by the Chinese, the rest of the world combined, 70% of our young people are now showing that they're too obese to come into the military.
You would wrap up.
You get my point. Thank you.
Yes,
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Murphy is next. She's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this conversation that we're having. And while I recognize and agree with my colleagues that there are a lot of issues that are really important as far as our military is concerned and how well we compete with our near peer adversaries, and I know that we will have time and other hearings to address that, I also understand, having worked at the Department of Defense, that at the core of our strength as a military are the men and women who are willing to serve. And so having conversations about our force and who's within it is important. And I also, without a doubt, agree that the issue that we're talking about is not reflective of the majority of our service members. However, there are some issues that are of concern, and I think primarily we've gone around in circles about what it is we're talking about and what type of extremists. But for me, what I think we're trying to figure out is, are there people who are serving in the U.S. military who, through actions or belief, believe and have acted on a set of extreme ideology that would either interfere with their ability to defend the U.S. Constitution or cause them to defy the civilian orders of their political leaders and therefore not be able to carry out their jobs as service members. And if we are looking at that as the heart of what the issue here is in defining what actions or extremist ideology that we're concerned about, I'd like to ask the witnesses, how can we collect data on that type of characteristic within the force so that we can have a more informed conversation about how widespread this is?
As I was saying to Ms. Slotkin, I think that a number of things could be done. One of them is to use the Command Climate Survey to get a better sense of what the problem is or is not. And I think we should have a consistent discharge code that can be tracked, and what is reported to Congress. There should be a regular report on this topic that includes other than those cases that naturally rise independently, but also include cases that are reported through that discharge process. So that would be where I would start in any case.
Great. And so having talked a bit about getting a better feel and our arms around how widespread the issue is within the active force, I'd like to turn to the veteran force. In previous Congress, I worked in a bipartisan way to improve the Transition Assistance Program, which prepares service members for life after the service. And I believe it was Mr. Brooks who said that the unity of being a part of the military is a way to deter participation in extremist groups. In the after military service members transition out, they are often disconnected from that unit. So my question is, are there things that we can do in the transition process that would ensure that there's more resilience within the service member to reject or to be able to not be brought into some of these extremist groups that then use the skill sets that the U.S. military, using taxpayer dollars, provided these individuals against the U.S. government?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the question. The Southern Poverty Law Center does ask that the military provide an off-ramp and kind of an off-boarding as people separate from military service and prepare for reentry. As you mentioned, sometimes, especially so when someone is involuntarily separated, it's important that there be support services that mitigate against that veteran thinking that they were not valued and then just kind of separated and thrown out. And because it's people like that, veterans like that, that are soft targets or completely vulnerable to violent hate and extremist groups. We would say that there needs to be additional supports across the board, something that is offered to all service members as they re-enter civilian life, just so that they're better prepared.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mrs. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, who we got next on our side here? Mr. Franklin is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Franklin, are you hearing us? Mr. Franklin. All right. We got any other? I don't see any other Republicans on. Mr. Franklin is playing. Mr. Franklin. Not with us. I don't see another Republican. Ms. Hartzler. Well, Mr. Moore, are you with us?
I am with
We
you.
have
Thank
a winner.
you,
Go ahead.
Chairman. I have the honor to be with.
Mr. Moore, sadly, we have lost you. You have frozen on us. We cannot hear you. So I'm going to give Mr. Keating a shot, and we'll see if we can work out the other stuff. Mr.
Today,
Keating.
we're hoping.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we set, Mr. Chairman? Bill Keating.
Yeah, yes, we are, and I apologize, Mr. Moore. We're going to have to get you back later. Mr. Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your comments earlier in the hearing, so that there's no mistake what this hearing is about, and any attempt to recast it and the reasons for it really aren't on point. So thanks for keeping us on point here. Let me just deal with something. There's been some back and forth, but there's something I don't think there's any question about. And that's the fact that these extremist groups have been targeting our military groups at different stages, and they're targeting them, encouraging them to enlist in some instances. They're targeting recruits. They're targeting active service members. They're targeting retired service members. So that is indisputable. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because so many of these people have military training. So they have that type of training, and it gives their organizations more legitimacy. So that is one way to, I think, to view this, so there should be no question about the fact there's a problem. I'm just going to ask our witnesses, are there ways or suggestions that we have where we can look more carefully at those recruitment measures by these extremist groups. Target, what sites they're going after. Target what groups of people they might be going after, so we can combat that. Is that a great approach to take during this? Is that something that could be useful?
Yes, sir, Mr. Keating. I think that is absolutely a wonderful suggestion and something that we should prioritize, because remember that some of the extremist group websites and social media are being accelerated by our adversaries. And this is proven. This is not a conjecture. So digital literacy is a key element of protecting our force, and keeping on top of that social media and website landscape is a key part of our effectiveness of our force. If you have an extremist group whose server, and there are several, are actually hosted within Russia, that should be a concern for our force.
Thank you. Any other witnesses have any other suggestions in that regard?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for the question. I agree that, in a previous duty assignment when I was in the Marine Corps, I actually did what was called information operations. And I think this is an opportunity for us we should delegitimize these extremist groups. And I think one of the things our government, our society, our military can do is to wage an information operations campaign against extremist groups to delegitimize them in the eyes of the American public and in the eyes of service members. This is a good opportunity to also send a clear message to our enemies, to America's enemies, that we are a strong nation who will defend our Constitution, and to remind them that the American service member does not fight because he or she hates what is before them, but the American service member fights because they love what is behind them. And that is a harrowing message. If I were an enemy of the United States, I would not want to hear that message. That would scare me.
Interrupt. I'm sorry, sir. But thank you for that. The other, given the time that's left, is more a comment, because I don't think you're going to be able to respond directly. But also a reason to have this hearing and to have this approach is for greater transparency. If you look at the inauguration itself, during the inauguration, there was a screening all of a sudden after January 6th of some of the Guard and active duty members as well that were there. So that screening was there. 12 people were removed. There was statements from the Pentagon. 2 were identified with extremist groups. The others might have been in some gray area or criminal area. But the point is this: when we're dealing with this, there should be acknowledgement of why and exactly what standards are there, why someone, for instance, in this instance, was removed from that duty at the inauguration. And it should be clear to everyone as to why, because we're going to have to deal with issues of trying to get to what criterion we use. We've discussed it here. What's extremist, what isn't. The training effectiveness that's in place, is it working? What responses are there? And other members of the military, what are their obligations in reporting themselves? Is it a mandatory obligation or not? And these are the things we have to discuss at other hearings. I bring that up as a comment. Due to time, I'm going to have to yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Keating. Appreciate that. So here's what we're going to do. Ms. Brooks, first of all, Ms. Brooks needs a couple-minute break. You may take that. I'm going to be wrapping some stuff up here. I've got 3 people left on the list. We have Mr. Panetta, who's going to be next on our side. Mr. Moore, if we can get the Zoom thing fixed there, will then come after. Mr. Moore will be next, actually. And then Mr. Panetta, and I have Ms. Jacobs. Those are the 3 people I have left who have not asked questions. Going to ask a question. I have one. Mr. Rogers and I have to get to a 2:30 classified brief. So if the questioning takes us past that point, those members who are left to ask questions will also have the great honor of wrapping up the hearing at that point. I do have one quick comment and then one question from Mr. Berry, which I'm going to have to get in now because I have to leave in a couple of minutes. The most important comment is this hearing is really important to have the discussion. And Mr. Keating, I think, said it quite well. And the terrible thing is we've got demagogues on both sides. And sorry, Mr. Gates is the best example of the demagogue problem that we have today. He talks about the fear of people are being silenced, and then he says we shouldn't be talking about this. Okay, so you just differ on who you want to be silenced. It's not so much a matter of whether or not silencing people. We're having a hearing to have these discussions, and I think my Republican colleagues have contributed a great deal to this discussion, because I am very concerned about overreactions to this. You know, I will not go into this in great detail because my staff would pull their hair out if I did, but I am concerned that we are targeting people the blink of an eye and shutting them off from jobs and everything because of something they said in some cases 20 years ago. Okay, you know, that's going on, and there's no reference point, there's no set of rules, there's no structure to that, and it becomes just this, you know, excuse to jam your views down somebody else's throat. But for the members, and there's only been 2 that have said this today, that have said there's no point in having this hearing. That's just demagoguery. There is obviously 100% a point in having this hearing because we have so much disagreement about how to handle this. This is a problem. This is being discussed. This is being dealt with. This hearing is not creating this issue in the military, okay? It is an issue in the military right now that is being bitterly disputed by a lot of different people in terms of how to handle it. I would like us to stop bitterly disputing it and start handling it in an appropriate and fair manner for all concerned. And I think all 3 of our witnesses have brought crucially important perspectives on how we do that. That's what we're trying to do. So let's stop shouting at the other side saying we shouldn't even be talking about this. And furthermore, it's terrible that people are being silenced. That's just idiotic and demagoguery, which we don't need. Towards that end, I have a question for Mr. Barry. You've talked about how if you can identify people who are advocating violence, basically, we should shut them down. But that does leave open the question, what if you have people within the military who are advocating white supremacy? Openly advocating white supremacy, not from a violent perspective, not saying we should kill anybody, just saying I think white people are superior and people of color are inferior, and we ought to build our society around that principle. How should the military handle that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I should start by saying that as a first-generation Asian American who served in the military, I am acutely aware that there was a time in our nation's history when people of my ethnicity were viewed as, with suspicion, as potentially disloyal or even as enemies of this country, despite our efforts to prove our worth through military service. And even recent tragic events have now perhaps given me pause to question where there still might be some who question my Americanness simply because of my ethnicity. So to your question about what should we do when somebody is espousing one of these ideologies, I go back to one of my responses to one of the very first questions, which is, this is a leadership challenge, and that this requires good, sound leadership principles to address. And I think one of the questions is, to me, it reminds me a lot of, Mr. Chairman, when you said, did this person post this 20 years ago? Was it 10 years ago, or was it last week? And that, I think, raises the specter of rehabilitation potential.
Absolutely. But you would agree it's not just violence. Now, I agree with you. If it's like 10 years ago, if it's an offhand remark, whatever. But if you've got somebody who's in there right now actively, vocally advocating these things, that is something the military should be concerned about, even if it isn't necessarily linked to violence.
Yes, and I want to be clear that there are already mechanisms in place to handle that. And we've got fantastic prosecutors in the military that can and do address that, just as we do with federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice, FBI, et cetera. So, if somebody, but again, and I just again as a litigator, I look to what is the case law say? What is the jurisprudence from the Supreme Court?
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. You've answered my question, and I know there's other members who want to get in, and Mr. Rogers and I have to go. Mike, I want to give you a chance. Did you have anything you wanted to say for the good of the order?
No, just reiterate what I said in my opening statement. We need to tread very carefully here on First Amendment rights. This is dangerous territory.
Thank you. Now, we will try to get Mr. Moore. Do we have you up and working here?
Can you confirm that you can hear me?
We got you. Seems loud, seems clear.
Okay.
You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. I'll be brief. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member. I hope that my question actually strikes the tone that the Chairman just laid out. I'm hosting a delegation today of airmen, pilots, and active duty folks. and about this topic. And the resounding piece that comes from them is very, very small. I have not interacted with it. I have not had an experience with it. And I'm concerned, and I communicate this, I'm concerned that it gets blown up to too much. That's not me saying I don't think we should talk about it, and we have to address this. But my question to the experts today is, how do we make sure to overemphasize morale so that this doesn't become a resounding, a small minority of instances? How does that not become way too prevalent, if you will, that it hurts morale and it hurts the willingness for people to go and serve their country? That's my biggest concern with this entire topic. Is there systems in place to make sure that, if it's a communication strategy or anything of the like, how do we make sure that we do that for our men and women serving, so they don't get branded as this becomes more widely discussed?
Thank you. If I could respond to that question, I think that what's exciting about the stand down that the Secretary has called for and conversations around this, we need to invite conversations around our differences and commonalities. I think that we need to normalize conversations about what is going on in the broader society, so that I don't know if you saw the recent 60 Minutes piece where service members who had been in for quite some time really welcomed the opportunity to have these hard conversations. And so once we begin to normalize that, I think it takes it outside of the possibility of it being seen as something that is happening or not happening in the military and not in the broader society.
I would also add, sir, that the morale is extraordinarily important, and your question is extremely sensitive, and it requires very great care. But our armed services need to be concerned with good order and discipline. And if you have members of that armed services espousing ideas that attack and alienate other members, you're going to have a dissipation of the strength of the force overall. So that's a morale problem too. So I think in a very sensitive way, if we handle this and have these conversations, we're actually going to be strengthening morale.
Mr. Moore, do you have anything further?
Nope. I'll yield back. I appreciate that concept. I'll yield back for time constraints.
Thank you. So here's what we're going to do. I've got three people now. Mr. Panetta, Ms. Strickland has returned, and Ms. Jacobs. So I have got to go to a classified briefing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to trust the three of you. Mr. Panetta, you are going to speak, and at 5 minutes, hopefully you're done. And then you turn it over to Ms. Strickland, and Ms. Strickland will then turn it over to Ms. Jacobs, who will then wrap up the hearing. And hopefully we won't have any glitches between here and then. So Jimmy, I am turning the committee over to you, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
I got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And obviously, thanks to you and to Ranking Member Rogers for not only having this hearing, but yes, for discussing it, for dealing with it, and for leaning in on it, and therefore your leadership on it. So I appreciate this opportunity. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here, and obviously your preparation and your knowledge and your expertise on this issue, and your willingness to take the time to come talk about it and discuss it as well. So thank you very much. I guess following up on a couple of questions that just were posed to you, I didn't necessarily, in regards to the chairman's question, Mr. Berry, in regards to what disciplinary options are there, is it just UCMJ? Are there other ways to go about it if somebody, if there is some sort of, somebody owns a white supremacist sticker or clothing or magazine or something like that? What are the options that the commanders have at that point?
Thank you, Congressman. Military leaders have a plethora of options available to them to address disciplinary matters. It doesn't just have to go to UCMJ. In fact, that would be the most drastic, a court-martial would be the most drastic measure taken. Less drastic measures could be administrative separation. So that's separation from the military that doesn't carry with it a federal conviction and criminal record and other collateral punishment. It could be a reduction in rank or other forms of administrative punishment or administrative discipline, or it could just be counseling, training, sort of some of the rehabilitation efforts that we've discussed here previously. If you suspect that a service member, that a junior service member might be susceptible to becoming a victim to radical and extremist ideology and then begin down that path, then I think it's incumbent upon leadership you have to know your troops. And you have to address it early and nip it in the bud as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it can spread. And so, but to answer your question briefly, Congressman, yes, there are any number of options that fall short of court-martialing and federally prosecuting a service member.
Okay. And look, on that aspect of training, I think, if you've been in the middle, sat through those less than effective training programs that can happen sometimes. Apparently, I guess what the word was in regards to the recent unit-led extremism stand down, that there was a lot of boxes being checked was the feeling. Is there any other DOD efforts that we've heard about to not just standardize, but to make better and more effective this type of training for our military members who need it the most?
Yes, Congressman, I'm aware of the article, I think, to which you're referring about the, sort of the proverbial checking the box, and I think that is something that DOD leadership should be concerned about, is not being perceived as merely checking the box. One of the things that I've learned in my experience on active duty is that nothing brings together service members to truly form a bond and forge a bond like shared adversity. And once you have that shared adversity and you've forged that bond of unit cohesion and morale, then there really is a sense of collective accountability. And so I think instead of this being pushed down from a top-down approach.
Claim my time. Thank you. I'm just running down of time. Let me just kick it to Ms. Cronin and give her an opportunity to answer that as well.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Yes, sir, Mr. Panetta. I do wish we had someone here from DOD because I'm sure they would have more ideas, but I would say that the military is excellent at developing people of character. And one of the ways that they do that is through personal counseling and personal mentoring of other military members. So we need to have our leaders at the top levels, but also our NCO leaders who are able to counsel those who show the signs. But in order for them to counsel, they have to know the signs. And currently, I'm not convinced that they do.
Fair enough. And basic on that, I know Mr. Keating and I got just a little bit, Ms. Cronin, what is the role of individual service members and peers addressing other peers when they see that? Is there any sort of training or mandate on that one?
Sir, I don't know about the training or mandate currently. That would be an excellent question for DOD. I will say that after the horrible tragedy at Fort Hood in 2009 with Major Hassan, one of the criticisms that was made of those around him was that they did not report their concerns about his behavior. So we need to make it safer for people to report their concerns in this kind of a situation. And I think the military knows how to do that. And they need to protect those who come forward too.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Cronin. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Ms. Strickland.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you to all of our panelists who are here. So a bit about my background, and I share this with Ms. Brooks, is that my father served in the military, fought in 2 wars, and he joined the military when it was segregated. And he was stationed in Korea where he met my mother. And so, when I think about extremism, I agree that we are not trying to suppress anyone's right to express themselves or hold beliefs, but we also know that extremism can have an effect on morale. I also know that, when people join the military, they're really young and they're impressionable. And so as we think about how we screen people for extremist ideology, can you talk about how we can improve the screening process and who is actually participating in a screening process who will know to look out for extremism? And I will direct that to all of our speakers, but I'd like to start with Ms. Brooks, please.
Thank you, Ms. Strickland. I would refer back to just what Dr. Cronin was sharing, that it's important that the people who are doing the interviewing or the recruiting also be trained on identifying the signs. And so the recruitment officer, the people that are working out in the field, the first commanders, they all need to be able to recognize the signs of some exposure to extremist thought. And there's a whole kind of, database with respect to tattoos and this kind of thing. There's a lot of screening that is done currently when a recruit joins the military. All that we're asking is that being able to identify the signs of exposure to extremist thought and behaviors, that be a part of that. We're also looking at taking a closer look at what happens in between, because we recognize that some people enter the military already radicalized, some become radicalized while they're in the service, and then again at reentry. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Berry?
Yes, Congressman. I think it would be interesting and important to study and perhaps try to distinguish between, as Ms. Brooks just said, those who enter the military already having been quote-unquote radicalized, and then those who become radicalized after joining the military. I think that is an important distinction. I also think that there can be ways. Our recruiters, our military recruiters, go through a pretty robust training program to become recruiters. So I think that can be incorporated into their training in terms of, in the same way that they identify membership in criminal gang activities and whatnot. But I do want to caution that there is, I think, a potential constitutional danger in asking service members or would-be service members to essentially self-report. I think that raises some First Amendment and Fifth Amendment implications.
Great, thank you. Dr. Cronin?
I think I agree with what my fellow witnesses have said. I would only add that I'm not necessarily talking about self-reporting. I'm talking about those around the person who is expressing extremist ideas or showing signs in terms of tattoos or using websites inappropriately. It's usually their buddies who know that first. So they need to be safe enough to be able to report that to their leaders.
Yeah, and thank you for your responses. And again, I will just emphasize, and I have, a good friend who attended one of the military academies, and he just reminds me again, you have people who join the service, they are young, they are impressionable, and if they have contact with people with extreme views, it wouldn't be a surprise if they started adopting them themselves. And also too, reminding us that the commander-in-chief can set the tone for how people think about how we interact with each other. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for all for being here. And I'm now going to yield to my colleague, Representative Sarah Jacobs.
Well, thank you so much, Marilyn. I actually want to follow up on your question. But before I do that, I just want to say to some of my colleagues who have expressed concern about this hearing that I'm hearing from constituents very frequently. Members, I represent San Diego, which is a proud military community, who feel like the extremism that they're seeing in the military denigrates their service. And hearing from parents who are afraid about their children, and in particular, their daughters' safety while they're in the military. So this is not about trying to go on a witch hunt. This is about making sure our service members are safe and are not surrounded by extremists when they join the military to serve our country. So I wanted to of people being recruited into the military who are already radicalized, the problem of people who are radicalized once in the military, and the problem of people who, upon leaving the military, radicalized. And I recognize that we need more data on all of this, but Professor Cronin, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about if you think those three are the actual bucket, which one of them poses the biggest problem, or should we be focusing the most on?
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Jacobs. Part of the time you were talking, there was a pause in the Zoom. So if I did not understand your question, please correct me. Of the three places, recruitment, in active duty, and then leaving active duty, I think that the most dangerous is probably leaving active duty on the basis of, this is just on the basis of my impression, because again, we don't have that data. But I think we need to make sure that our veterans have access to the kind of training and information and education that will prevent them from falling into these kinds of extremist ideas.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And then
Ms. Jacobs, we're having trouble.
Rip Jacobs.
In the hearing.
Yeah, we're having a tough time hearing you.
Ms. Strickland, if you
Sarah.
could take the gavel back if this continues, that would be wonderful.
All right. So is there anyone else who would like to speak at this time? All right, seeing none, so I want to thank our guests for being here. I hope I'm doing the right thing in lieu of Chair Smith. Thank you for this very robust conversation. I will just say that, this is a complicated issue that we recognize. We never want to trample on rights, but we want to make sure that we have morale that is strong. We have strong recruitment and retention numbers, and that the general public has trust in our institutions, including our military, that they are going to be people who are going to uphold their oath and keep us all safe and protected. I know that on January 6th, when there was the failed insurrection at the Capitol, and we heard that there were some members of the military and veterans who were part of that, it caused great alarm. So we love our military, we respect them, and we want to make sure that they have the tools they have to be successful, and rooting out extremism is one way to do that. So thank you everyone for being here today, and we are now adjourned.